And at this time, would you please welcome Dr. Amy Foster?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. Paul and I have had this email relationship for like a year now, getting talks like this organized. So I appreciate his patience with me. He occasionally has to bug me going, do you remember me? But yes, so thank you, Paul, and thank you for inviting me. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. Like I say, this is the basis. Well, this is actually just snippets from my book on the topic. So basically, what I'm looking at in my book is the process of integrating women into the astronaut corps. Integrating women into the astronaut corps is not a sexy title. I had to change it. The title of my dissertation was, in fact, Sex in Space, which makes perfect sense, and it does come up in Chapter 7. But it is something, basically, I mean, we think of sex as just biological difference, and so Sex in Space makes a perfect title, but like we say, we tone it down a little bit when we can. So I do want to talk to you about the history of women in the space program today. June 18th, 2010. Why is that important? No, it's my birthday. That's really why it's important, I think. But what made my birthday particularly special for me, given what I do, is this was the flight of STS-7, which happened in 1983, and this was a flight of Challenger. Again, why do we care about flight of STS-7? What you get from the indication here is this 7 here means it was the 7th flight of the space shuttle. Space Transportation System is the terminology that we use for the space shuttle. So the 7th flight of the space shuttle wasn't even the first flight of Challenger. All right, are we good here? So what makes this matter? Well, it's because of this woman. You all know this name? You recognize this name? This is a name that pretty much everyone knows, right out there with John Glenn and Alan Shepard and Neil Armstrong and probably Buzz Aldrin. There's some interesting stories there. That's another talk. He's a piece of work. But Sally Ride. We know Sally Ride because she was the first American woman to fly in space. All right? And this flight, like I say, happened on June 18th, 1983. So we're quickly actually approaching, right? We're quickly approaching the 30th anniversary of the first American woman to fly in space. But this actually is not when our story begins. We actually have to go back quite a bit further to talk about the history of women in the space program. Even though she's the first to fly, we've got a longer story than that. We have to go back to the beginning of NASA. NASA was actually created. NASA was created. Is that on? Could that be part of the problem? Yes. I'm okay. All right. I'll stay here. All right. Mandy says we're good. All right. So NASA was created in 1958 by President Eisenhower. This was basically, oh, that's a small image. This was something created by Eisenhower to fund science. So this was an organization that had no military connotations. That's how Eisenhower wanted it. On October 1st of 1958, NASA becomes its own organization. Almost immediately after NASA is created, NASA starts working to select its very first class of astronauts. And these are probably men you've seen before. All right, so we've got, this is basically, well, this is the Mercury 7. All right, so these are familiar faces to most of you. We've got Gus Grissom, Scott Carpenter, Deke Slayton. Over there is Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Wally Schirra, and Alan Shepard. All right, so there's our first 7 astronauts. All right. This is really where the history of women in space begins, although not quite actually in space, but the story starts here. Not long after the Mercury 7 were selected, a man by the name of Randy Lovelace, and what that says is General Donald Flickinger, came up with this other idea. Now, General Flickinger was an Air Force general who was working at Wright-Patterson Research Center up in Ohio. And Randy Lovelace was a physician, and he ran a clinic out in Albuquerque, New Mexico, private clinic. And it was at this clinic that all of the Mercury astronaut candidates went through their medical testing. All right. These two guys got together and said, all right, well, we've picked our we basically weeded out who can and cannot be an astronaut medically for the men. NASA's picked its 7. But let's think about this. Who else might be good astronaut candidates? And they started thinking about women. Why think about women? Well, it comes down to basic physics. When you launch, physics, when you launch any vehicle, for every pound of weight, and we'll call it cargo, every pound of cargo that you want to lift, and that includes the weight of the vehicle, the dry weight of the vehicle without fuel, anything that you're carrying up to leave there, like a satellite, any food, any oxygen, and any people weight is all cargo. For every pound of that you want to lift, you need 3 pounds of fuel. All right. So it's basic physics, it's basic, and it's basic finances as well. It costs a hell of a lot less if you can send up less weight. Well, men and women in the room, on average, women weigh less, all right, because we are smaller, all right? So there's a basic savings right there. We use less oxygen. Well, we have to take all of our oxygen with us when we go into space. So you take less weight in terms of oxygen. We also eat less, so we take less in food. So we're talking basic weight savings here, which makes it technically more feasible to get into space if you send women. So the question is, are women medically qualified to be astronauts? These two doctors knew exactly what the medical qualifications were. Now we just need to see if women are capable of actually doing that. So in 1960, they brought this particular woman in. Her name is Jerry Cobb. She was a pilot, had been flying planes since she was 16 years old. So she was more than capable as a pilot. She had a fairly extensive number of hours in small planes. So they brought her in and said, would you be willing to go through these medical tests and see if women qualify? She said, absolutely. She took these first round of tests and did beautifully. Actually, in some cases, did better than some of the men that were tested. As a consequence of her success, she and General Flickinger and Randy Lovelace sat down and put together a list of other women they would like to invite for testing. They recruited 25 women, 19 were tested, and 13 in total passed these medical exams. All right. Now, you might have actually heard this story before. It's a story that a number of historians have started talking about. It keeps coming up from time to time. It kind of makes the newsreels. There's a few books about them. What I would impress upon you is they're not called the Mercury 13. All right, that is a name that has been attached to them, but that's not what they were ever called. They were called the Fellow Lady Astronaut Trainees, or FLATs. This was actually a name that Jerry Cobb gave the group. She communicated to all of these women by mail, and that's how she always addressed the letters. Dear Fellow Lady Astronaut Trainee. All right, so they're known as the FLATs. Now, I basically told you that this is the brainchild, this whole idea of testing women is the brainchild of these two gentlemen. Neither one of them were NASA employees. One was an Air Force officer. The other one was a private physician who had been contracted by NASA to do the medical exams for the Mercury astronauts. This was a project on their own. This was never a NASA project, okay? So after these 13 women were tested, there were 2 more phases of medical testing, a psychological exam as well as a second physiological exam, a more advanced physiological exam. Not all of the women went through all 3 phases of testing. Jerry Cobb and 2 others were the only ones who went through the second phase, and then Jerry Cobb is the only one who went through the very last phase of testing, which was scheduled to be held Pensacola, Florida, at the Navy base there. when it was time for all of the other women to go do their testing in Pensacola, the Navy went, we're more than willing to have these women here and do the testing as long as NASA approves. As long as NASA basically puts up the money and says, we're cool with this. Again, this wasn't a NASA program, and NASA said, we're not committed to putting women in space at this point. So they basically said no, and the whole thing gets scrapped. So now you have 13 women who have perhaps been given the impression that they were going to be astronauts if they pass these medical exams, and you now have a handful of these 13 women who are really pissed off. All right, to include Jerry Cobb. She's a tough lady. She is a determined lady, and I give her a lot of credit for that. But she's still very, very angry and is still petitioning for a ride into space, even though she's now in her 70s. What she did, though, along with one of the other 13 women who passed the exams, named Janie Hart, who was married to Philip Hart, who was a senator for the state of Michigan, managed to get a hearing up in front of the House Subcommittee for Science and Astronautics. And what these two women did is they went before this subcommittee and basically petitioned Congress to tell NASA that they needed to sponsor this program, that women should be allowed into space, that this was an opportunity to beat the Soviet Union, put a woman up in space first. And that was important because the Soviet Union had been successfully beating us over and over and over again. And this is just a short list of the Soviet first in space. We've got Sputnik 1. We all remember that one with its beep, beep, beep. That's all it did. That's pretty much it. Either way, it certainly was a technological and political kind of nightmare for the United States. Within a month, they launched Sputnik 2. That one matters because they put a dog on it. All right, it was a girl. I'll just point that out. All right, so my dates are cut off. So it's November 3rd, 1957, they launched Sputnik 2. What's more important about this is this had a cargo. This was a vehicle. I mean, by the time you get the capsule with Laika the dog inside, this is something that weighs well over 1,000 pounds. So this is actually significant weight. And if you can lift 1,000 pounds and get that into space, you definitely can get a nuclear warhead on top of that. And that's really what makes it disconcerting for the United States. But this is twice now they've beat us. And then in 1959, if you notice the date, the Soviet Union is really, they're really big into prestige. And that's going to be important when it comes to their Women in Space program. So they made sure to launch on October 4th, because not only is it the anniversary of Sputnik 1, but it's also the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. So they really, those dates really mattered to the Soviet Union. And then on April 12, 1961, they launched Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. So we've been beaten over and over again. This was our opportunity to put the first woman in space. Well, they beat us there too. In 1963, they launched this woman. Her name is Valentina Tereshkova. She was launched aboard Vostok 6. And there's actually a couple of different firsts as well. Not only did they launch Vostok 6, but 2 days before, they had launched Vostok 5. And so they basically, these two vehicles were in orbit together, and there was kind of this supposed rendezvous in space, although they never got actually that close, but they kind of saw each other and waved. But they did manage to get two vehicles up at the same time, which is kind of impressive. But they put their first woman up. So the question is, and for the Flats, this was just crushing. Here was an opportunity for us to put a woman in space first, and we missed it. The Soviet Union beat us again. So why did the Soviet Union beat us again? Well, because of this. Do you recognize this photo? Who is that man? Yeah, you all know that one. That one's easy. Even my students can do that one. Yeah. What is he saying? Yes. Yes. On May 25th, 1961, he says, we will put a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth by the end of the decade. And it's like, okay. Notice the date, May of 1961. This is, did anyone remember the date when Yuri Gagarin was launched from the previous slide? April 12th, 1961. This is now basically 6 weeks later. In between Yuri Gagarin flying and this speech, we've launched Alan Shepard. We finally got something off the ground. That's good. All right. So Alan Shepard has flown. And this man is now saying 3 weeks after that date, after that flight of Alan Shepard, we're going to put a man on the moon. All right. So why does this mean the Soviet Union is going to be first in putting a woman in space? Well, because now NASA has to deal with this problem. They've been told they have to get to the moon by the end of the decade. That could be the end of 1970. It could be the end of 1969. That was a fudge factor that NASA was more than happy to have. But they now have 9 years, or 8.5 years, to get to the moon and back. All right? Now let me tell you why this is just a nightmare for NASA. Alan Shepard's flight lasted 15 minutes. We had 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience when NASA was told, go to the moon. Crap. All right. NASA is busy. All right. From this moment on, they are trying to figure out how to get to the moon. They've only flown one person at this point, and he hasn't even done an orbit. We have to figure out how to orbit. Then we have to figure out how to make the vehicles last long enough to actually get to the moon. The trip to the moon is going to take 3 days. It's going to take 3 days to get back. You're probably going to want to spend a little bit of time there. So let's say 7 days these things have to last. We've only tested the vehicle for 15 minutes. All right, we don't know if it's going to last this long. Battery technology is not that advanced. By the time Gordon Cooper flies, who's the last man to fly in the Mercury program, he was in orbit, I think it was 2 or 3 days. Every system in his vehicle, except for life support and the clock, were dead. The battery power, they had pushed the battery power as far as they could take it in 1962. All right, so this is the technology we're dealing with, and we have to get to the moon. We still have to figure out how to rendezvous in space. We still have to figure out how to dock in space. We still have to figure out how to build a rocket that's large enough and capable enough to get us to the moon. All right? We also don't know if people can survive that long. There's a lot of steps that have to be taken before we can do what this man has asked. All right? So NASA is busy. Do we have time to redesign a vehicle and train a woman to put her up so we can be first? No. So that's why the Soviet Union beats us in another first. So what changes? Something has to change for the United States to finally decide women should be in space. Well, it basically comes down to the agenda and the vehicle. All right. And the vehicle, it's the space shuttle. So this is Sally Ride on her very first flight. Just actually a pretty good picture of her, so I'd like to show that. So the space shuttle is what's going to change. Oh, by the way, I need to give credit where credit is due. This photograph, while I did a little photoshopping, was taken by my mother. Really? At the STS, I'm not sure I remember, February of 2007. Yep. All right. So the space shuttle is what changes. This is what's going to make it possible for women to have the opportunity to fly in space for the first time for the United States. Why does a space shuttle matter? Well, it has something to do with how the space shuttle was marketed. NASA was building this vehicle, and they had to get funding. They had to get funding from Congress, and they had to get funding from the Office of Management and Budget to be able to fly this vehicle. And the way you convince the bean counters to build this ship is you say, this is going to be a valuable ship. This is going to create a lot of opportunity for the United States. First, these are no longer experimental vehicles. Lie. That's not true. But this was, the idea behind this was, with the space shuttle, we'll be able to fly up to, and this is actually a number that they put out there, up to 60 times a year. Space flight will become routine. All right? It's no longer, that was the idea, is if we could fly that many times, and unfortunately we never even got close to that. I think the most we ever had in any one year was 12. It would start to be routine. And unfortunately, that is a mentality that we bought into, that even NASA bought into. And it ends up resulting in complacency that we see leading to things like the Challenger accident and the Columbia accident, unfortunately. But they were selling it as routine flight. So you know what? There's less risk involved. We can basically put anybody we want on a space shuttle if it's routine flight. All right. So that's how they sell it. This is a vehicle that's approved in 1972. Designs were already being hashed out. The designs actually started for the space shuttle in the late 1960s, before we ever actually got to the moon. They're starting to work on this. But by 1972, the money comes in to start building the space shuttle, and it's going to take about 5 years before we even have something that can fly. But it's going to take some time. With the introduction of the space shuttle, knowing that this vehicle is going to fly, hopefully by 1977, then 78, 79, keeps getting pushed off and because of development problems. NASA's going, all right, we need more astronauts. Part of the benefit of a vehicle like this is it can carry more people. It's going to carry up to 8 people, ideally. So we've got more space. That means we need more astronauts. So NASA actually makes a call for new astronauts. This class of astronauts is known as Group 8. They put out the call for applications in 1976. And by 1978, this class of astronauts will be selected. However, when they made this call for astronauts, they basically put out this very broad call. We want everyone to apply, anyone who's qualified. There's something else that's changing about this space shuttle. Before, basically, when NASA was calling for astronauts, they were looking for pilots. Well, this is a different kind of vehicle. We're not just interested in pilots. We still need pilots because someone needs to fly this thing. But this is also going to be a vehicle where we're going to do scientific applications. So we need scientists, and we need engineers, and we need doctors to be in the astronaut corps to fill this thing. So we're not just turning to the Air Force or the Army. Actually, there haven't been Army ones. Really not too many Army astronauts. But Marines, Navy, Air Force. We turn to the military for all these other astronauts. There also were 2 groups of scientist astronauts for the Apollo program, but this is much broader. So this is an open invitation for anyone who qualifies, anyone who has a science degree, an engineering degree, or a medical degree, along with some pilots, call. All right, we want your application. Well, applications came in slow, and they came in particularly slow from women and ethnic minorities. All right, partly because women need to have those degrees. And it's only, by 1976, there's still a limited number of women in those pipeline careers. So those pipeline careers being, do you have an engineering degree? Do you have a science degree? Do you have a medical degree? Well, there's a limited number of women to choose from. So how do we get these women to apply? We pull out the big guns, is what we do. You recognize her? This is Lieutenant Uhura from Star Trek. All right, Nichelle Nichols is her name. NASA recruited her. They said, we would like you to go out, talk to the people, and tell them we're serious about women applying, and we're serious about ethnic minorities applying for these positions. Now, it's not entirely clear how much influence she had in getting these people to apply. But by the time the call for applications closed, they had received 8,000 applications, which it was significantly more than any other class had ever received. So we give a lot of credit to Lieutenant Uhura. All right, so 1978, our first class of astronauts to include women were introduced to the United States. All right, in this class, there were 35 people. I think it ended up being 15 pilots and 20 mission specialists. Mission specialists is this category that NASA creates as part of the shuttle era it is kind of the label for what these scientists and engineers and physicians will be doing. In that class of 35, we had 6 women, 3 African Americans, and 1 Hawaiian American. Those were the guys. These are the women. All right, so we have, left to right, Shannon Lucid, Ray Seddon, Kathy Sullivan, Judy Resnick, Anna Fisher, and do I understand we have her mother-in-law in the room? I might want to chat with you later. Hello. And Sally Ride. All right. So these are our first 6 women in the astronaut corps. All right. I want to talk to you a little bit more about what this means. Now that we have women, and this is some of the reason that we couldn't even think about doing this in 1961, is there are design issues that are going to be important once you introduce women into the astronaut corps. And this is a big part of what I do in my book, is not only do I look at all the cultural expectations that have to change and the social standards that have to change, but then you actually have to look at the technology. All right, we're going to be putting men and women together in an itty-bitty living space. All right, despite the fact that this was significantly bigger than any space capsule that we had launched before, we're still talking about a fairly small space, about 1,000 cubic feet. I think actually it's closer, it might be closer to 1,200. Either way, that's really small. Okay. Cubic feet. So 10 feet by 10 feet by 12 feet. That's it. It's basically my porch. I mean, we're talking small, with perhaps 8 people. Now, the advantage is you can stand on the ceiling and you can stand on the walls. So cubic feet, you know, we can make much more use of 1,200 cubic feet in space than we can here. But living space is going to you, and you're going to ask these people to live together anywhere between 2 to up to 16 days, 1,200 cubic feet. So there are some issues of propriety. There just simply are going to be. Now, in all of the astronauts that I've interviewed, basically they all said, you know, we managed to figure this out. They're professionals. They're working together. They'll figure it out. When I was talking to Kathy Sullivan about this, she basically just said, you know, we had a working relationship, and when I wanted to change my shirt, she would just go, guys, I'm changing my shirt. And that basically meant float in another direction. Because there's not a whole lot of room. But at some level, if they looked, you know, you deal with it. So they managed to figure it out, but it is something that does make Americans a little uncomfortable. All right. Toilets. This is an issue. Because you can't hold it for 5 days. All right. So toilets. How do we make toilets work for men and women? Well, toilets are actually fairly new to NASA at this point. There's really only one other time that they have a toilet, and that's in Skylab. And basically, the design for the toilet for Skylab was very similar to what they used in the space shuttle, and ultimately then in the International Space Station, although there have been some design changes as a consequence, well, over time. But toilets are a big issue. How do you make this work for both men and women? Because toilets in space are missing something very, very important that toilets on planet Earth have. Gravity. Gravity takes care of a lot of our business, all right? But you don't have gravity in space. So you have to figure out a way. Oh, okay, I know I've got a picture. Launch and landing, that's going to be important too. Oh, okay, there's our living space, by the way. Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's divided into 2 decks. You've got a flight deck up here, and you've got the mid deck. And basically, when you start looking at pictures, when you look at Sally Ride's second flight, and there were 6 of them on that flight, I believe. Basically, the commander sat up here in number 1, which was the commander's chair. Sally Ride slept in the pilot's seat. No, there were 7 on that flight. Kathy Sullivan basically sacked out down here. One guy was in the airlock. One guy was strapped to a wall, Velcro, wonderful thing. And 2 guys just floated. And that's basically sleeping arrangements. That's kind of how you work it. Here's our toilet. Here's our lovely toilet. Okay, so gravity. How do we work without gravity? Well, a fan. A fan. You know, I actually went to space camp as a kid, and the guy that gave the lecture on the toilet was so embarrassed because he's talking to like 30, 16-year-olds, and he has to go, and when the shit hits the fan. Because that's literally what you're doing. You have a fan that basically is providing some suction, all right, to pull everything down away from you. The first thing you want to do when you get in here, strap yourself in, okay? These are not handles. These actually swivel and go over your legs to hold you to the seat, and then you turn on that fan, all right? And you don't turn off the fan until everything's all cleaned up, because the last thing you want are things escaping from the toilet. Aren't you all glad you finished eating, right? Okay, but I love this stuff. This is good stuff. All right, the thing is, how do you design this for men and women? Now, if you notice, this is not your typical toilet seat. It is butt-shaped. All right, so basically you want a seal. You want to make sure you've got a good seal. So this is basically designed to fit your posterior so that you don't have any leaks. Now, this is largely actually just for solid waste material, all right, this part. What you see down here, you see this hose? That would be for your liquid waste material. All right, part of the reason we separate this out, there are two reasons. Weight. It goes back to this issue of weight. You have to bring everything back. Everything that you bring back down is weight, and that changes the flight profile of how this thing lands. So wastewater you can dump overboard. Cool. All right. But there's also water in fecal material. So what they actually did is literally the shit hits the fan. I'm not kidding. It's sprayed along the outside of a canister, and then it's exposed to the vacuum of space, and it freeze dries it. It's brilliant. So not only are you removing some of that water in the process of that process with the fan, but then you're also actually killing any bacteria. So it doesn't smell nearly as bad as it could. All right, so it's actually a very functional toilet, but it's great. However, this hose, this is actually the harder design. All right. Okay. That's launch and landing. I'm going to go back for a minute. I'll get there. It's great. I know, but you got to. Okay. All right. So, back to this hose. All right. So the hose has to work differently for men and women. All right. Men have, as you all probably know, a little better capacity for aiming a urine stream than a woman. All right. So for the men, everyone has to use this hose, so that's kind of gnarly. So everyone gets their own funnel. All right. The men get a normal-looking funnel, and they just aim. All right, which is good, because the last thing men want to have to do with this thing, remember the fan's running. The last thing a man wants to do is hard dock. All right, and that's the terminology they use. So no hard docking for the men, because this is a vacuum cleaner, okay? Women, however, don't have the same luxury of being able to control this urine stream. So women do have to hard dock. There's no real way around that. And they actually worked on multiple different designs for this funnel. You can't just have a regular funnel. If you're going to hard dock with a vacuum cleaner, you can't have the suction be quite as strong. So there are escape valves in this nozzle so that air can get through, so that the pressure is not quite as intense when a woman is going to put this up next to her body. All right, so that's how they basically have to do this. Everyone gets their own funnel. The women all got to play with the funnels. Very fun. The problem with this works. It generally works well. There was a particular flight on Judy Resnick's first flight. The crapper crapped out, and then that was a whole other issue. They actually had to bring him down a day early, and it was not good, not pretty. And I read the debriefing, and they were like, "You guys have got to figure out something else for the ladies," because the guys, there were options, but for her it was tough. Another time, I guess, I'll tell that story, because I could go on for this all day. The thing is, you can only get to this toilet when you are not strapped in. Generally, most of the time, that's not a problem. However, during launch and landing, you have to be strapped in. All right, so that's where this thing comes in. This was actually a design that was not accepted, but I found this design in the archives at Johnson Space Center. This is part of a larger piece. Now, the reason I bring this up is the way the men have always done this. If If you guys have ever watched The Right Stuff, you know that when Alan Shepard was going up, it was a 15-minute flight. No one thought, well, he's not going to have to pee. He's only going up for 15 minutes. Well, he sat on the launch pad for about 5 hours after having 6 cups of coffee. All right, so there was no system in place for him to relieve himself. And he did actually have to pee in his flight suit. So after that, NASA came up with a plan. We got to find something. Well, for the men, it's basically nothing much different than a condom with a hose attached that goes to a collection bag. And that works fairly well. Well, there's nothing like that for women. All right. If you don't, there's nothing external that you can just slap up there and have it work, short of a catheter. We don't want to use catheters. Catheters introduce bacteria. On top of that, for landing, the women are going to have to do that themselves. They're not going to have any help. So we don't want to go catheter route. So we need to find something external. And this is part of the external design. All right, so you have this, I call this the chastity belt design, because you start with this, and what you can see here is you've got this set of briefs with this little hole down here. And that's for basically the tube that's going to be leaving this device. This is actually an artifact. This was the initial design, and this is now, it's not on display, but it's in the collection at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum. So you can see this is about 3 inches long. This is made of hard plastic. And basically what you do is you just snuggle that puppy up there, and with the crotch, the briefs, and a little surface tension, ideally this stays in place. So you've got this then attached to a hose that then goes to the collection bag, and that's the little part that's sticking out that hole in the briefs. The women did try this. Not the most comfortable thing. I have to say, when you put this on, you are sitting in a seat laying on your back. So it's not necessarily the most comfortable thing. The other thing is the women were concerned about whether this would stay in place and perhaps leak. So they weren't real keen on this particular idea. So step number 2, we'll develop something else. And this is what NASA develops. This is Sally Ride's diaper. All right. This is also in the collection at the Air and Space Museum. But NASA loves acronyms, so we don't call it a diaper. We call it the DACT, the Disposable Absorbency Containment Trunks. Okay. Basically very padded bicycle shorts. And I was telling the table earlier, unfortunately, while they were still having dessert, that this was actually, this basically is disposable diaper technology. And it comes out of a development from the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the 1970s. In an attempt to develop a way to grow crops in semi-arid soil, what the USDA came up with was this substance that, when it's exposed to water, turns into a gel. And so it would actually hold water in semi-arid soil and support crop growth. Well, perfect for disposable diapers. All right, so this is actually the technology that is being introduced, that NASA is taking and developing these diapers. Now, these are custom designed for each of the women. They had multiple sets of these. And unfortunately, because they are custom designed, they cost about $1,000 a piece. But, however, they loved these. These were great. Compared to that other design, this was fantastic. In fact, the women were so comfortable with this, and they did test it out. You know, Ray said and tells me, yeah, I took my pair home and laid in the bathtub and gave it a try. And they were good with it. This, at least, they knew wouldn't leak. And they ended up having an advantage over the men because they had tried this out. They knew it worked. They were comfortable with it. Well, the men, now having this design that is now 30 years old, or well, 20, 25 years old at that point, Alan Shepard, you know, we go back to Gus Grissom using the first one. This is what had been in place. The men are now laying on their backs. Well, they haven't tested theirs. And now they're laying there, and they're not so sure it's not going to leak. And so the men all went, we want these. So now every astronaut wears a diaper. We no longer use these, the specially made ones. in part because the technology has developed and they can use, oh, I guess I don't have an image. They now use basically off-the-shelf products. All right, so it's basically depends. But because it's NASA, you have to have an acronym that goes along with it. So we now call them the MAGs, which is the maximum absorbency garments, instead of the DAG. But that's basically how you have to deal with it. All right, now that gets women into space. This isn't the end of the story, because what we have are women who are scientists, engineers, and physicians flying. What we still don't have are women pilots. And that goes back to these women. Women have been pilots pretty much since the Wright brothers started flying and people started flying after that. I think the first woman to get a pilot's license, I think it was 1912. All right, so women have been flying a long time. We know women have a stellar record of service in flying vehicles. I mean, we've got the WASP. We know about them. So there's a history of women flying. However, to be an astronaut, a pilot astronaut, you have to fly jets. All right, and in the 1960s and 1970s, until the early 1970s, the only place to get jet training was in the military. All right, well, women can't fly in the military, so they're not flying jets. So it's going to take a little longer for women to be in the pipeline careers that they need to be in to get the training to qualify as pilot astronauts. Now, it's in 1974, I believe, that the Army lets women start going into helicopter training. And then by 1976, the Navy and the Air Force have opened up pilot training to women. All right? And that's where this woman comes into play. This is Eileen Collins. She is the first female shuttle pilot and the first female shuttle commander. She was in the Air Force. She was selected to be a member of the second class of women to go through pilot training in the Air Force. And then when she was selected to be an astronaut as part of Group 13 in 1990, she had just completed training at Edwards Air Force Base as a test pilot. So she basically had all of the qualifications needed to be a pilot astronaut. She had jet experience. And the test pilot thing is something that NASA isn't so insistent upon anymore, but that's what it was in the 1960s, which is part of the reason none of those women were qualified in terms of their education backgrounds to be astronauts in the 1960s. But now we finally have women who are qualified to be pilot astronauts. So she flew her first flight on STS-63 on February 3rd, and that is actually 1995. And STS-93 in 1999, she became the first female shuttle commander. This particular flight down here, STS-114 in 2005, was the return to space flight after the Columbia accident, and Eileen Collins was the commander of that. That wasn't anything planned. Basically, she was next in the flight rotation, but I find it particularly special that the person who returned us to flight was in fact a woman. So she's actually really very nice. I like her a lot. So where do we stand? Now that I've been talking for I don't know how long, right? I could talk on this all day. There's probably some names you recognize and a name that you don't recognize. The name you do recognize. We'll start with the one you don't recognize. Commander Peggy Whitson. Why is she on here? Well, in 2007, I believe it was. Yes, it was 2007. It was the same year. These two, same year. Commander Peggy Whitson served as the commander for the International Space Station. So now not only have we had a woman as a commander of the Space Shuttle, we've had a female commander of the Space Station. While Peggy Whitson was commander of the Space Station, Susan Still Kilrain was the commander for a Space Shuttle flight. So we actually had two female commanders on the International Space Station at the same time in 2007. Then we have this, which I still would love to write her biography. You know, we all know Lisa Nowak was arrested at Orlando International Airport for potentially accosting a love rival. I mean, it's a huge scandal. It's a scandal for NASA, and you know, it was criminal. Unfortunately, because she was a woman, I actually heard a lot of stories. You know, some of the responses I was hearing was, this is why women shouldn't be astronauts. This is 2007. She made a mistake. She made a really bad error of judgment. You know, and she was in a bad place when she made that bad decision. But the reality of being an astronaut is you're put under a lot of social expectations for your performance are huge. In many cases, well, in every case, these are pilots, these are scientists, these are physicians, and these are engineers. I don't know how many engineers there are in the room, but as an engineer, I can say we're not very good at the social stuff. So when you now have people like engineers who aren't necessarily very good dealing with people, who are now thrown into the spotlight and expected to be heroes, that's a lot of pressure. All right. On top of that, for a shuttle flight, you train for a year minimum. All right. For that year, you are thinking about nothing but that flight. And then you fly, and that is probably the highlight of your life. And then you come back, and there's nothing. You know, that emotional letdown is not insignificant. And for an astronaut who wants to stay in the flight rotation, admitting psychological problems is not a good career move. So you have a woman like Lisa Nowak. This all happened 6 months after she returned from her first flight. So like I say, her marriage was disintegrating. She's at this low point in her career, and she made a bad decision, a really bad decision. But unfortunately, it reflects largely on the astronaut corps and the women astronauts as a whole. And there was a lot of animosity among some of the women astronauts towards her for kind of tainting that image, and it's unfortunate. So you have the highs and you have the lows. But following Lisa Nowak, we have another high, which is STS-131 and ISS Expedition 24. And the reason I bring these up, this is actually the shuttle that went up in April. It was April. Yeah. And ISS Expedition 24 left from Kazakhstan. But as a consequence of that, for the very first time, we had 4 women in space at once. We had 3 women on the space shuttle. This is Stephanie Wilson. This is Naoko Yamazaki. There we go. She is an astronaut for the Japanese Space Agency. Dorothy Metcalf Lindenberger and Tracy Caldwell Dyson. And she's on the she's on Expedition 24. So she went up with the crew for the International Space Station, like I say, out of Kazakhstan, and will be there for, actually, she might still be there. It's usually a tour of 3 to 4 months. And these 3 came back when the shuttle landed in April. So for the first time ever, we had 3 women on a shuttle crew. And for the first time ever, we had 4 women in space. So we're starting to get represented, which is nice. But where we're headed, you know, the question with NASA now is, where are we headed? That's going to be one of those things that we're going to have to figure out in the coming years. The next 5 years will be very interesting to see how this all works out. However, if we are going back to the moon, and if we are going to Mars, and hopefully we will, those are going to be longer flights. We're not going to the moon just for a day anymore. We're going to be going for a duration. And if we go to Mars, it's probably a 3-year trip. That's ideally how we'll do it. It's a year there, a year out, a year there, and a year back. So that's a long time to be away, and it's a long time for mixed crews. And how the psychology of all that is going to get worked out is a big question. And when I talk about sex in space, it becomes a whole new issue when you're away for 3 years. And how NASA is going to deal with that is going to be very, very interesting. And it's not something, when I actually interviewed a woman who was the director of Johnson Space Center. She was also the first woman ever on a selection committee for the astronauts, and she was the only woman on that selection committee. And she was on the selection committee who selected these first 6 women. And I asked her, is NASA ready to talk about sex? And she adamantly said, no. The problem with NASA is it's a federal agency, and it gets all its money from the federal government. And that means it's in a very tenuous position about making sticky social decisions. And to put someone up in space, to put a couple in space and say, have at it, is probably not something that's going to make too many people happy. And so it's an issue. It's an issue, and it's something that NASA hasn't dealt with fairly well. It has not dealt with very well, but it is something that they're going to have to deal with as future agendas get figured out. So that's where we stand. It's been a lot of successes, some down points at times, but I think it's something that we should look to with a lot of hope. I'll leave it with that.
Thank you, Amy, for a magnificent presentation. And if you have any questions, we would like to entertain them at this time.
Got some there.
Very good talk,
Thank you.
Amy. We were fascinated by it. But the way you ended up, they don't want to deal with sex in space. And you're talking about a 3-year trip to Mars. Pregnancies only take 9 months.
Yeah.
What if they end up with a baby on Mars? They're going to have to deal with it, obviously.
They are going to have to deal with it, and honestly, that one is so difficult. I am not, as painful as it is for me to say, I am not convinced that the first woman to get pregnant in space won't get death threats from right-to-lifers, because we don't know what's going to happen to that child. There have been many experiments on the shuttle and in Skylab in terms of what happens to a fetus, and it's not good. So I think, for a woman to make a decision to get pregnant in space and to have a child in a gravitational environment that is not the Earth is a lot of unknowns, and it's difficult, and I'm not sure that's going to go over very well. The way the policy is now, if a woman gets pregnant or is even trying to get pregnant, she's out of the flight rotation. She is out of the flight rotation. She is not even put on the list to fly. Yeah. Anna Fisher was out of the flight rotation. Ray Seddon was out of the flight rotation. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? When my son worked for NASA about 5 years ago, teaching the astronauts to fly the space shuttle, there was a very strong culture of type A personalities who thought it was a sign of weakness to ever admit they were wrong.
Yep.
Many people thought this tragic flaw contributed to the Challenger and Columbia accidents. From your research, do you think that the inclusion of more women in the program has changed the NASA culture, and if so, in what way?
Good question. The one side is these are all very strong-willed women. You don't get where they are without being dedicated and putting up with harassment. So are these necessarily the most the women that are coming in and going to nurture? I don't know. They're strong-willed women, and it's hard to say whether they're really coming in and thinking about that. Psychology. It really comes down to psychology. Probably, there probably is some influence, but I think when you're dealing with the astronauts, you're looking at a group of people, where it is hard to admit mistakes. This first class of astronauts, this first class of women astronauts, were very much aware of the fact that everything they did was going to be scrutinized, and it was also going to set a precedent. And when Sally Ride was named to the flight, whenever she made a technical decision, even if it was the right technical decision to make, she sat down with the other 5 women and basically had a powwow and said, does this make sense to you? Would you change it for you? Because let's get on the same page. Because the last thing we want is for someone to come along behind, and it's Judy Resnick was the woman who flew after her, The last thing we want is for Judy to come and change a setting that I said is the way it needs to be done, because the response will be, well, they're just being bitches. So they were very careful about that, and it's, when you look at those women, are they making the kind of, I don't know. It's really kind of hard to gauge. There's plenty of women at NASA, both in management, both as engineers now. I don't know. I think perhaps. It's hard to really gauge.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I have two, if I may. One is pretty simple, I think, probably. How do women handle menstruation in space? And the other concerns the triangle, and I stress triangle, among Nowak, the other woman, and the man.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow it seemed to me at the time all this was going on, the man got out of this scot-free, and he's one of the major players in this that instigated a lot of the trouble. How did he get away with that?
He didn't. He was fired.
Was he?
They both were.
I never knew that.
It was page 6 in column B.
So they never really gave it equal play.
No, they did not give it equal play. It did not make the same news coverage, but they were both sent back to their respective branches of the military.
No, both. You mean all three? Or?
No, Colin Shipman was not. He was not married at the time. I mean, what he does with any woman is kind of up to him. She was the victim. Colleen Shipman was the victim. Whether we approve of a love triangle, whether it was a love triangle, it doesn't matter. But she's the victim here. She is still in the Air Force. I think Lisa Nowak has been dismissed from the Navy. So I think she has really suffered, and Bill O'Fallon is still in the Air Force. But both Lisa Nowak and Bill O'Fallon, who were the two astronauts, were both dismissed from the astronaut corps.
Well, I thought the man involved, I thought he was married at the time. O'Fallon? Bill?
He might have been separated. She was separated. I think he was divorced.
Well, what about the menstruation?
Menstruation. It's up to them. You can suppress a period with birth control pills, and that's an option. Or you can just deal with it as they go. And that was an issue. That was certainly something that the engineers were concerned about. Actually, the engineers designing the toilet were concerned about it because they were concerned about what the discharge might do, because they're like, well, I mean, they were really concerned about mucus. And they sat down with the 6 women and went, we're concerned about mucus. And they kind of went, okay. What about mucus? Well, don't women have more mucus? And they're like, look, probably not really. But you know what? Let Sally fly, and then she'll come back, and you can take the whole toilet apart and figure it out and determine whether it's an issue. I mean, the women basically said it's a non-issue until it's an issue. And that's basically how they approached menstruation as well. They basically said, all right, we don't quite know what's going to happen. We don't know whether you're going to bleed excessively. We don't know whether you're going to have problems with edema. There's lots of questions that we don't have because we've never done this before. So what they ended up doing was basically, if you choose not to suppress your period, then they send you up with your choice of tampons or maxi pads or a combination of both. With Sally Ride, they sent up 100 tampons. And men,
That's more information.
it takes me 6 months to use 100 tampons. I mean, my God. That's more than any woman is going to need in any length of a shuttle flight. But they didn't know what was going to happen. If there was excessive bleeding, they just wanted to be prepared. And so, the women basically said, let Sally take all 100 of them, and you can count how many are left when she's done. Yeah. And we'll go from there, and we'll know. And if it's a problem, we'll deal with it then. So basically, it's not been an issue. Everything has functioned as status quo, and they can suppress it if they wish. Pretty much, nothing changes. Yeah.
Amy, I'm in the medical field,
Uh-huh.
and I've been a recovery room nurse. And when we had our first female anesthesiologist in the male anesthesiologist locker room, we had to take pity on her and bring her to the nurses part to change. So I work here on Earth with this issue.
Yeah.
So here's my question: has NASA thought about having, we humans are going to be having these issues going on forever, no matter how many toilets you design, no matter how much the engineers think about what they're doing. How about sending up females, and how about sending up males? And you'd have this whole issue eradicated.
Well, in 1999, there was a discussion about sending a female crew. It was seen as a political stunt and canceled. That was about the same time that John Glenn went up, which of course got Jerry Cobb all upset again. They're like, if you're sending up a 77-year-old guy, then you should send up the 66-year-old woman. She was still bitter, and she still is, and I can't do anything about that. Yeah, she does. We all do, and that's really kind of the issue. A lot of what I look at is you can dictate policy, but you can't change people. Yep. The women will figure out a way to make it work. The men will die eventually. And, we just keep educating our sons and our nephews and and we go from there. It's a process it's slow change.
Yes, two related questions.
Okay.
Tell us about your parents and how did you get started on your career?
My father just retired as a pilot from Delta Airlines last Saturday. He was in the Air Force for 22 years. He was a B-52 pilot in Vietnam. So I think because of my dad, I've always been looking straight up. And I wanted their jobs. My room in high school was plastered with every newspaper article about the shuttle and about these women. They were my heroes. So I was always looking up, and I went to school to be an astronaut. That's why I have an engineering degree. And then I just kind of got sidetracked and got into history. And well, this table has heard it, but I was working on a second degree and was looking to fill out a semester schedule one semester and found a course in history of technology and absolutely fell in love. So not only, I had studied my rockets that I loved, but now I could study the history of my rockets that I loved, and it was perfect. My mother is a retired clinical social worker, and they live in Minnesota. Is that enough?
Your toilet discussion generated a lot of interest.
Yeah, toilets are fun.
And I had one other question about it, and that is, I had heard that they were transforming the urine into drinking water.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the case, or are they ejecting
Well, they're doing it. See, they're doing it on the International Space Station. It's not as important on the shuttle because those flights are short. But yes, they're recycling as much as they absolutely can on the International Space Station. Yes. Oh, filters are great.
Okay. If there are no other questions, then I would like to again thank Amy for this wonderful discussion. Appreciate it. Thank you. Hope to see many of you at the art reception on Sunday.